We'll discuss the role of systemic racism in the justice system, and Larry will highlight recent changes that have had an effect on harsh and severe sentencing. And now just a few words personally about Larry. We know Larry, but it's good to be reacquainted with each other. Larry is married to Linda Hewitt, who we also know, and between them they have 4 children and 8 grandchildren. They have been members of Knollwood for 7 years. Larry is a master woodworker and volunteers at Habitat for Humanity in their woodworking shop. He also works part-time at the Tanglewood Golf Shop. Larry has been involved in many ways at Knollwood. Presently, he's a member of All God's Children and cares deeply about matters of justice. So Larry, welcome. Welcome. We're glad to have you tonight.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
And my first question, just to start us out, is tell us a little bit about your experience in the federal criminal justice system.
Okay. Well, I graduated from law school in '69, went in the Army for 2 years, came back and was a state prosecutor for 2 years. And then after that, for some 40 some years, was in private practice. And I began sometime in the '70s, become involved in criminal defense in the federal courts. At that time, there were really very limited federal prosecutions, mostly bank robberies and thefts of Social Security and federal checks. But anyway, I became involved, and gradually, as the volume of criminal practice dramatically increased in the federal courts, I became more and more involved, to the point that I would say 75% of my practice in general was criminal defense, and probably 50 to 60% of that was in the federal court system. I did 2 types. I represented paid clients. I represented doctors, lawyers, whoever, business people, in a lot of different varieties, a lot of white collar crimes. And these were both black and white. They were not just white people. But I also felt a need to be involved in representing indigent people, those that could not afford counsel. The federal system had a court-appointed system set up where they would pay you on a very limited scale to come in and represent people that couldn't afford lawyers. And I did it for 2 reasons. I did it I felt like I needed to pay back. I had a comfortable life. I had a nice law degree, and I needed to pay back. And I also felt like that there was a need for effective representation of these underprivileged, socioeconomically deprived people who may not get good representation sometimes. So I felt that obligation. And secondly, got some really interesting cases that way. So it paid off in many directions. If you'll let me toot my horn just 1 second, I'll tell you when I left the federal practice, a federal judge in open court put this on the record. He said, "I've had you appear in front of this court. You've done it with great zealousness for your client. You have done it with great panache. I don't know anybody that's ever litigated with you that hasn't come away with more respect for you than they had when they started. So I would like, just for the record, to reflect that the court appreciates all the work that you have done." So with that bit of, I practiced extensively in federal court, very aware of the system there. Let me say this at the outset: 2 things. Number one, I'm not here to bash the federal court system or to bash federal law enforcement, and that I'm here to provide what I consider some of my own experience, and also information I've researched about the federal system. So we're going to talk about that, and we'll get on into that. Now, what the question is or was the federal judicial system systemically racist? The answer, in my opinion, is yes, for various reasons, which I'll explain. And here's what I think. This is personal opinion. You can all agree or disagree with me. Sometimes systemic racism occurs unintentionally. I think that happened more so in the federal court system than it did intentionally. There is a book that many of you read called The New Jim Crow, in which the author, her format is that this was another example of the white man putting his foot on the neck of the black man and holding him down, the so-called war on drugs. I don't really buy that to that extent, but that's fine. That's her opinion. I do think, though, because of the nature of the system that I'm going to discuss with you in a minute, clearly the system was racist. It was systemically racist. Black defendants were sentenced extremely tough, hard sentences that didn't affect white people as effectively, but it dramatically affected the Black community. And I'll tell you why. Until the 1970s and 80s, you didn't hear a whole lot about drugs in this. You know, 60s, it sort of had the explosion. And as I said earlier, there wasn't much going on in the federal courts by way of criminal prosecution. By the mid 70s and 80s, there was an explosion. We had the so-called war on drugs. We had the drug czar, who was a federal employee. We had new federal omnibus federal drug laws. And one of the reasons for that was that the drug business was not only international, it was interstate. You had 50 different states trying to prosecute these things that were interstate and international, and it just wasn't effective. So the federal government stepped in and said, we've got universal jurisdiction. There's one court system in sense of one set of laws and one jurisdictional issue in the entire United States. So we can handle all this. So they've got, they had the DEA, the ATF, the FBI, I don't know, 7 or 8 federal agencies that all of a sudden became very involved in drug prosecution. And so you also had until 1986 the ability and sentencing purposes for the federal judge to sentence anybody to the statutory maximum, which in many drug cases was 20, 25 years. So we had a judge in Charlotte named Maximum Bob Potter, Robert Potter, and Maximum Bob lived up to his name virtually every time he appeared before him. Drug prosecutions and others too were just hit to the limit. Now, on the other side of that coin, we have a new judge, relatively new judge in Charlotte named Max Cogburn, and they called him Minimum Max, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but he's sort of on the other end of the spectrum there. So, but anyway, you had this sentencing, and then in 1986, a federal guideline system came in, which was supposed to uniform the system so that judges were required to stay within certain confines. And this was a structured sentencing system where you had every crime had a number associated with it, 1 through 43, which had a number of months, and then you had six levels of criminal history for you get certain points for convictions. So you could, depending on the crime, the volume, for instance, in drugs, the amount of drugs, or in a financial transaction, the amount of money involved in the financial transaction, you could move right on up the limit there and get into 25, 30, 40, in 30 level drug sentencing. But here's what really happened a year later. And the so-called the federal system enacted a new drug law, which was called the anti-drug law in 1987. And here's where it really affected the Black community and became, in my mind, very systemically racist. One of the drugs that became very, very prevalent in the Black and the white community was cocaine. And there were 2 types of cocaine being distributed. One was the powder form, which it originally came in, and the other was what's called crack or crack cocaine, which is a cooked cocaine it's much more potent, much deadlier, and much smaller amounts are necessary to be sold. And predominantly in the white community, powder cocaine was the drug of choice. Predominantly in the Black community, crack cocaine was the predominant drug of choice. It was easy to be sold. I'm not going to get in. There's a whole different side of this as to the socioeconomic reason why drugs were prevalent in the Black community and that type. I'm not going to get, that's a story for another day. But just say that there was an abundance of distribution of crack cocaine in the Black, predominantly in the Black community. Now, here's the kicker on that. For sentencing purposes, the ratio of crack cocaine to powder cocaine was 100 to 1. An example of that is, for sentencing purposes, if you had 1 ounce of cocaine, you would be sentenced at a certain level. To get to that same level of sentencing with powder cocaine, you would have to have 100 ounces. So you've got a very small amount of crack cocaine that gets you into the 15, 20-year bracket. Plus, there's a mandatory minimum of 5 years for crack cocaine, which didn't exist for powder. And so what happens here is that the black defendants that came before the court charged with crack cocaine were getting sentenced astronomically higher than white or black for that matter, but predominantly white, that came into that court with just powder cocaine. It just didn't take very much. And here's the other thing that really drove the sentencing and really affected the black community, in my opinion. There are about 3 levels, really 2 major levels of distribution of cocaine, or any drug for that matter. You've got a kingpin up here who's the financial man who sits on top. He doesn't touch the stuff, doesn't come in contact. He just arranges and finances. You got in between a couple of middlemen that make distributions out here and there. Then on the bottom right, you may have 15 or 20 what they call street slingers. In other words, people that were out there distributing crack cocaine. They may have a few grams here and there, and maybe the total of, using, just picking numbers as an example, let's say they distribute an ounce over a period of time. And let's say there are 20 people involved in this so-called conspiracy. And under the federal conspiracy law, any member of the conspiracy is responsible for the entire conduct of the entire conspiracy, regardless of how large or how little your participation was. So here's what happened. Little street slinger down here sells his 1 ounce over a period of 6 or 8 months. There's a total of a pound that is starting at the top. For sentencing purposes, the street slinger gets the whole entire 1 pound attributed to him for sentencing purposes. So he's not being sentenced for 1 ounce of cocaine, which may get him 5 years. He's being sentenced for a pound of cocaine that's going to get him 20 years, 15 years. And if he's got, like a lot of these people tragically do, have criminal records, I mean, some of these people are looking at life. Some of these people got life for distributing cocaine, and these were predominantly Black Americans. I'm not saying it didn't happen to whites, but it happened astronomically more to the Black community than it did to the white community. So what happened between 1986, when this came into being, and 2010, when I'll talk to you about where a change was made, this, what I can refer to as draconian sentencing, occurred with regard to these imbalances in the amount of cocaine, the conspiracy theory, and this affected the Black community tremendously. So one of the statistics I have seen or dug up was that I think the Black community, depending on what the figure is somewhere in the United States between 12 and 13%. They constitute 13% of the entire population. The Black population in the federal system is 38%, which is more than white and is more than Latino and it's more than anybody else. Let's put it that way. So you see the disproportion. It is 3 times, the population in the prisons is 3 times greater than the population in the country. So this is why I say either intentionally or unintentionally, and you can debate that amongst yourselves if you want to. That's why I say the system was and still is to this day, but not as bad, systemically racist, because a system was set up that dramatically prejudiced the Black community as far as sentencing was concerned, and again, as far as the population in the prison system was concerned. Now, the good news with regard to this is in 2010, this is under President Obama, they had a Fair Sentencing Act was enacted, which reduced the ratio from 101 to 18 to 1, which dramatically reduced, again, the sentencing impact. More significantly, and this is it was under the Trump administration, just in 2018, I've forgotten the name of the act, but the reduction was reduced to 1 to 1. So the sentencing ratio now is 1-to-1. So that if you have crack cocaine, excuse me, if you have crack cocaine or powder, it's the same. And it's interesting, in the state system in North Carolina, they make no distinction between those two. So the sentencing is the same for both in the North Carolina state system. But those two have had a dramatic impact. And what I think you've also seen, and I think this is largely because of the pressure groups, the Black Lives Matter. There's some others against the mandatory minimum sentencing group out there. There's another group against these tremendous criminal sentencing. And so the pressure has come largely from the Black community, has come to deal with these issues. And I think that's why you've seen some of these reductions. But what you're also beginning to see, you saw it during Obama and you saw it under Trump, although it didn't get the publicity maybe it should have, of these commutations of sentencing. People that were in there, non-violent drug offenders. A lot of these were drug users. They weren't just profiteers out there on the street. They were either addicts themselves or trying to make money just to support their family. They weren't these big time drug dealers, but some of these people, as I said earlier, got 30 and 40 and life sentences for that kind of thing. And President Obama, and at least I remember, he commuted about 1,200 sentences down from, let's say, from life to 10 years. Some of them got what's called life, time served. If they'd served 10 years, that was the end of their sentence. And I think that was done in the Trump administration. But what needs to be done, I think, going forward is to revisit this. I mean, we've got this disparity. The conspiracy law is not going to change, but we've got this disparity that affects the cocaine aspect of things down. But what needs to be done, in my opinion, is to analyze, have a committee or somebody, some kind of congressional committee or something, begin to analyze the sentences that these people have gotten. See, what's happening is these people that were sentenced between 1986 and 2010 are still in there serving these 40 and 50 and 60 and life sentences. They're not, they're still stuck. They're not getting any benefit of this new law. It wasn't retroactive. So they're stuck. So what you need, I think, going forward is some kind of committee. I don't care who does it, to analyze these prison sentences and determine that some of them are just ridiculous for these people who are nonviolent. And by the way, this is sort of interesting too, up until recently, a drug offense was considered a crime of violence, which also affected the prison system you went into, how you were treated in prison, how you were categorized and all that. I don't think that's the case anymore, but there needs to be an ability to look at these horrible sentences and say, look, this wasn't right and it's been changed now. Let's bring those sentences up to current standards, so to speak, with what would happen to somebody today. For instance, somebody that was sentenced with that 101 ratio ain't going to be sentenced to that today. They're going to be sentenced to a 101 ratio. So there needs to be that kind of review. What we can do, I guess, as citizens is to participate in, find out who these groups are, participate in them, write your congressman. People say that all the time. And, drug reform is not a real politically sexy thing to talk about, but it's something that is on the forefront now. It's a time to hit it now, where it's out there being dealt with by people, and it, like a lot of other things, is coming up on the front burner, and it needs to be dealt with because there are people just rotting away in prison doing nothing. The other sad thing about particularly the Black community, in my opinion, is when they come out, they've got a federal conviction. A lot of them have prior convictions. So where do they go? They go right back to the hood, right back to the old bad friends they had, right back to the old bad neighborhood they had. And lo and behold, in 6 to 9 months to a year, they're right back in the system. Recidivism is very, very high, particularly drug convictions in the criminal justice, in the Black community. The most amazing program that I know about, and this is just locally here, is Roddy Stillwell's program. If somehow they could implement that kind of program as opposed to just throwing people in jail and forgetting about them, you'd have citizens coming out that were productive again instead of people who were coming out going right back in. Now that's a big bill. I understand that, but rehabilitation, drug treatment is very important. A lot of these people going in are drug addicts. They're not hardcore business people out there. They're drug addicts. That it costs a fortune to maintain these people in prison. If you just want to get down to basic economics, it costs a fortune to keep somebody in prison for life when they're 25 years old when they go in. That's just the crass economic aspect of it. Mm-hmm. So all of these things are things that I think need to be dealt with, need to be addressed. There's certainly been progress made in the area from a standpoint of legislature. And it's not just, I mean, I don't want to sit here and tell you that I'm, that it's just, it's across the boards. I mean, the Latino community is now becoming very active in the drug business. They're 31% of the population in prisons, federal prisons, are Latinos or Hispanics. They're in the same boat, sort of socioeconomically, as the Black community down there. And it's a way of making money. And quite frankly, the major supply now of all drugs are the Mexican cartels. It's coming in from Mexico. Everything is virtually. But, there's just this disparity that continues to be a result of, as I said earlier, not something we're going to get into in detail, but the socioeconomic aspect of the neighborhoods these people live in, the lack of education, the lack of hope, the lack of anything. I've said this before. You get some of these 25-year-old young kids out there who are, dealing drugs, and you ask them why. You say, well, or let's put it this way, 18 or 19-year-old kid, and you ask him why. He said, well, shoot, I'm probably not going to live past 25. I'm going to make a bunch of money and have a nice car and a bunch of gold, and that's all I can do. I'm never going to get out of here. And that's a horribly hopeless. None of us here can relate to that. I hope, but that's a horribly depressing feeling to have to realize that's the outlook of a 19-year-old Black kid in the hood of a life expectation of 25 or 30 years, and I will be dead or in prison, one of the two.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much it. Let me say one thing. I did a lot of other things besides represent people that had drug problems. I mean, that was the majority of the federal courts. It's interesting. 75% of the prosecutions in federal courts right now are drug-related cases. Mm. They're just beaten down. Judges get excited when you bring in some kind of money laundering or some kind of financial scam or something like that. And the other side of the coin is, real quickly, is the worst thing you can do in federal court is go to trial. Their conviction rate is 94% across the country. And you get slammed on sentencing if you go to trial. It's just the nature of the beast. They just can, what you try to do is work out some kind of deal, work out something to reduce the sentence and all of that kind of thing. And quite often it's interesting, the defendants that have been in the system a little bit know that, and they don't want to go to trial. They'll tell you right off the bat, I'm not going to trial. Let's see what we can do. But these other, some of these other people say, by golly, I don't care. I'm going to trial. I mean, the worst case, real quickly, that I was involved in the appellate part of this, with this young man, 25 years old, charged with a big drug conspiracy, and they'd offered him a 10-year cap. In other words, most will give you 10 years if you'll plead guilty and if you'll provide some information. He said, nope, I'm not going. I'm going to trial. Life sentence. Life sentence. Life is life in federal prison. That's the kind of gamble you take sometimes when you roll the dice with. I mean, I'm not saying if you're not truly innocent, but you got to be careful down there about what you try and what you don't, because the sentencing is very heavy duty. Let's put it that way. Anyway, that's sort of my part of it tonight.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry, so much for your perspective and for all of that information, your stories, your clarification.